In the territory of Colorado, in the late autumn of 1883, there was a silver mine on the eastern slope of a ridge called Hatcher's Back that had been closed for 4 years and sealed against the rock by order of the Territorial Surveying Office. The notice nailed to the timber header at the shaft entrance named 6 men and the dates of their deaths. 3 had died in a single collapse on a Tuesday in October of 1879. 2 more had followed that winter, one from a bad pocket of gas no lamp would detect, one from a fall no one witnessed. The 6th had gone down in the spring of 1880 and had not come back up, and the search party had retrieved only his lamp and 1 boot. After that, the Colebrook Mining Company had posted the closure notice and walked away. The equipment sat in the cold. The shaft breathed cold air into the open. The county auctioned the mineral rights and the associated surface claim the following January, and nobody bid. Nobody except a 27-year-old woman named Vera Cassin, who paid $11 for the lot. The men at the county office did not laugh. They were too surprised to laugh. The clerk read her bid a second time and then looked at her over his papers, and she met his eyes without expression and asked whether he required anything further to record the transaction. He did not. She walked out into the January cold with a receipt folded into the pocket of her coat and a set of claim papers in a tube of oilcloth under her arm, and she stood in the street for a moment with her breath showing white and looked south toward the ridge she could not yet see. She had come to Colebrook 6 weeks earlier with $31, a rucksack, and a canvas roll of tools her father had left her when he died. Her father's name was Del Cassin, and he had spent 22 years as a mine examiner for the Federal Surveying Service before the bronchitis took him. He had examined hundreds of shafts across 3 territories, and he had taught Vera everything he knew, beginning when she was old enough to carry a lamp. She had walked behind him through drifts in Nevada and Utah and the western reaches of Colorado when she was 12, 13, 14 years old, and he had explained to her as he went what the rock was telling him, what the timbers said about the earth pressing above them, how a man read a mine's history from the way it had been cut and shored and widened and abandoned. He had taught her to take gas readings with a safety lamp, to recognize the way certain rock strata shifted under long-term water intrusion, to read survey notes the way other people read plain letters, and to trust the evidence in front of her eyes over any assurance from any human voice. He had also told her more than once that a mine that had killed men was not necessarily a mine that would kill again. Most collapses, he had said, sitting at a kitchen table with a survey map spread between them, come from one thing done wrong in one place. You find that place. You understand it. Then you understand what the rest of the shaft is. He had set his finger on a diagram of a stoping chamber. Grief is not a geological condition. Vera had been sitting across from him. She was 19. She had written that last sentence in a small notebook she still carried. She was not carrying the notebook into Colebrook out of sentiment. She had arrived because she had spent 3 months studying the Hatcher's Back Mineral Survey from the Territorial Archive in Denver, where she had spent 6 days in a reading room with her father's notes spread on the table beside the original staking documents, working through the 2 sets of records in tandem the way her father had taught her. The company's claims against the government examiner's independent findings, looking for wherever they diverged. The archive room was cold even in November, and the clerk had not been warm about a woman who asked for the Hatcher's Back file by number without any apparent hesitation or need for his help in locating it. She had let him be cold. She sat at the long reading table with 4 inches of documents and worked through them page by page over 6 days, making notes in her own hand. And on the 4th day she found what she had come looking for, the original federal staking survey, conducted in 1873 by an examiner whose name she did not recognize. had mapped the geological strata in the shaft site with a precision the Colebrook Company's subsequent documents did not replicate. The Federal Examiner had noted the dip and strike of the silver-bearing formation at the base of the proposed shaft, and his numbers placed the productive zone at a bearing of roughly south-southeast from the planned shaft center. The Colebrook Company's working plans, filed in 1876 when they began extraction in earnest, showed their cutting direction as northeast. The error was not small. It was 22 degrees off the Federal Examiner's documented formation bearing, consistent over the entire period of the company's operation, and it explained everything. Why their northeast drift samples had been poor, why they had pushed harder and harder into the west, aimed at looking for something richer, and why the main stopping chamber at the base of the shaft had never been properly worked. They had been cutting away from the vein for 6 years and had never gone back to check the original federal survey to understand why they were not finding it. What she had found in those records was a specific anomaly that had nothing to do with the deaths and everything to do with the shaft's original configuration. The 6 deaths had occurred in the upper workings, in a section the original surveying notes called the West Adit, where the Colebrook Company had been pushing laterally through a zone of shale intrusion with inadequate shoring. Every death was in that section or related to it. The main shaft below the 100-foot level, the original vertical bore and the stoping chambers off it, had never failed. The company had never worked that depth successfully because they had miscalculated the angle of the silver-bearing vein and had been cutting in the wrong direction for 2 years before the deaths forced a halt. Vera had seen the error in their own survey notes. The vein they had been chasing was not where they had drawn it. She knew where it was. If you have ever read a technical survey document and seen something in it that everyone who came before you missed, you understand what it is to stand in the street in January cold with a receipt in your pocket and a set of sealed claim papers and feel very still inside, not triumphant, still. The way a person is still when they are about to do a careful thing. She took a room at a boarding house on Colebrook's main street, owned by a woman named Hattie Pryor, who was 62 years old and had been in the district since the original silver rush of 1873. Hattie was not excitable. She set Vera's room key on the table when Vera explained where she had filed her claim, and she said, quietly, that the boarding house had done laundry for 4 of the 6 men. She did not say it as a warning. She said it as a fact she thought Vera should have. "I appreciate that," Vera said. "I don't know what you're planning," Hattie said. "I'm planning to go down." Hattie looked at her for a moment. "You know the shaft. I know the survey." That was what she had for the first 2 weeks. The survey. She spent those weeks at the mine in daylight, never going below the collar, working from the surface downward, clearing debris from the shaft entrance, examining the timber framing at the collar and the first 20 feet of vertical bore, checking each set of timbers with her hands and her weight, listening for the sound a timber makes when the rock behind it has shifted into compression. She cataloged what she found in a notebook in a column of numbered observations, the way her father had done. The collar timbers were sound, a 12 by 12 sill frame of Douglas fir that had weathered 4 winters and was still carrying its load without significant check or split. The first 2 sets below the collar, at the 6-foot and 12-foot marks, showed compression staining on the east side where the soil had settled unevenly, but neither set had deflected beyond what was safe, and the wedging was still tight. Below the 12-foot mark, the shaft entered solid rock, and the timbers from there down were set into drilled pockets in the stone rather than against loose earth, a technique that produced a fundamentally different kind of stability. She descended 15 feet on the rope she had rigged to test that first section, feeling each timber with her palm and her thumb, looking at the fit of each cap and post in the lamplight before she came back up. Everything she found was consistent with what the survey had described as a well-constructed main bore. The disaster had not come from here. She pulled the closure notice off the header on her fourth day, when she had enough context to read it with some precision. She stood at the collar and held it in the cold morning light and read the 6 names and the 6 dates, and then turned it over to read the issuing authority and the date of closure. She noted all of it in her notebook, and then folded the notice and put it in her coat pocket. She did not throw it away. A notice that named 6 men deserved to be carried carefully by the person who was about to go below the place where they had died. There was a man named Cord who ran the livery stable at the edge of town, a man of perhaps 65 who had hauled equipment for the Colebrook Company during the original working years and who had, by Vera's second week of daily passage up the mine road, taken to watching her from his stable door as she passed. On her 8th day, he walked out to the road and asked her what she was finding. She told him about the timbers in the collar section. He listened with his arms folded and his weight settled back on his heels. "The collar's good," he said after a moment. "Always was good. They sank the original shaft straight and true. Trouble was the west adit." "I know," Vera said. He looked at her with the kind of look that is not dismissive but is still measuring. "You come from underground work?" "My father was a federal examiner. I went with him." Another measuring pause. "How many shafts?" She thought about it. "Enough," she said. He unfolded his arms. "I hauled 4 of those men in from the adit when it went," he said. "I would like to see the west adit properly sealed before anyone goes below. Timbers and backfill, not just a notice." "So would I," she said. "That's what I'm doing first." He nodded and went back to his stable, and she went up the road to the mine. And after that, he left a mule at the bottom of the road for her use each morning before she arrived. He did not ask her anything further. That was the alliance, such as it was, and it was what she needed. The west adit took her the better part of 10 days to properly assess and another 8 to seal. She worked it methodically, examining the original shoring from inside the entry, using a hand drill and a probe rod to test the integrity of the walls, identifying the section that had collapsed and the probable cause, which was exactly what the survey notes had indicated. A zone of wet shale above an unsupported overbreak that had been carrying water for years before it let go. She found the collapse point on her second day of assessment. It was about 30 feet into the adit, where the lateral drift had crossed from the harder granite of the upper formation into a band of green shale that ran at a diagonal through the rock. The shale was soft with long-term water infiltration, and the original Colebrook shoring at that point had been inadequate. A single row of cap and post sets without lagging boards across the roof, which meant that when the shale had failed, it had come down between the sets rather than being held by them. She stood at the edge of the collapsed rubble and looked at what had happened and understood it completely. And understanding it entirely was what made it possible to see exactly where the failure stopped and the intact section began. The intact section from the collapse point back to the main bore junction was sound. The shale band did not continue that far. The adit had been cut through the shale zone and into a section of fractured granite beyond, and the fractured granite, though not beautiful, had not moved. She examined it set by set, tamping each post, checking each cap, rapping the lagging with her knuckle to hear whether the rock behind it had pulled away. 3 sets needed re-wedging. 2 lagging boards were soft with rot, and she replaced them from lumber she had brought up on Cord's mule in sections cut to length in Colebrook's mill yard. The sealing of the collapse section took the 8 remaining days. She brought material up in loads, timber lengths for additional sets, clean gravel and clay for backfill, a 100-pound sack of lime to stabilize the wet shale zone. She brought 2 additional rope lines, and a come-along for moving heavy material. She worked alone except for 2 days when Cord came up in the afternoon and held timber while she drove pins, and they did not speak much while they worked. When she had the entry sealed and braced so that nothing moving above could reach the main bore, she stood at the mouth for a while and looked at what she had made. Hattie Pryor asked her at supper that night whether she was ready to go below. "Not until I've run a lamp down from the collar," Vera said. "Let it hang for an hour, then read it." "Your father taught you that." "My father taught me everything I know about bad air. He said the lamp never lies to you. Men will lie. Rock will fool you. The lamp tells you exactly what is there." She lowered a safety lamp on a line the following morning and let it hang at 60 feet for an hour and 20 minutes while she sat at the collar with her back against the timber frame and drank cold coffee from a tin and watched the ridge above her. The lamp, when she drew it up, burned clean and steady. She noted the reading in her notebook. She lowered it again to 100 feet and waited another 45 minutes. Same result. The air in the main bore was good. Whatever had pooled in the old attic configuration had been cut off by her sealing work and was not communicating with the main shaft. She went down 3 days later, on a Tuesday in the middle of February, with her father's lamp and a rope ladder she had rigged to the collar frame, a probe rod and a hand drill, and a short pry bar in a canvas satchel on her back, and a coil of surveying line to measure her depth and her horizontal movement. She wore her heaviest work clothes and her father's old canvas coat, which was too large for her and had his name written inside the collar in his own hand. She had sewn one of her own handkerchiefs into the lining on the left side, a habit she had learned from him. A clean cloth for the eyes if dust was bad, or for wrapping a sample, or for covering a lamp wick in an emergency. She had not told anyone she was going down that morning. She had told Hattie the night before, and Hattie had nodded without asking the time. And Vera had gone to bed early and been at the mine road before the sun was fully above the ridge. The main shaft was 58 feet of vertical bore, straight and well cut. The timbers held. She went down slowly, rung by rung, feeling each timber set with her hand before she put weight on the next rung, listening to the shaft breathe around her. The sound of a shaft is its own kind of speech. This one was quiet in the way that a sound structure is quiet, not in the way that a place is quiet, because everything in it has gone still from damage. She had learned to tell the difference when she was 13, somewhere in the bottom of a Nevada copper mine, with her father just above her on the ladder, and she had not forgotten it. At 30 feet, the shaft was cold enough that her breath showed white in the lamplight. The walls were a dark felsite, smooth-grained and dense, with a thin iron oxide staining along the mortar joints where the sets met the rock. Everything was dry. At 60 feet, she paused and held the lamp at eye level and watched it, steady. The flame burned clean and upright, with no flicker and no color shift. The two things that would have told her to ascend immediately. She went on. At the bottom of the main bore, the shaft opened into a stoping chamber about 14 feet across and 10 feet high, cut out of rock that was a dark gray-green with iron oxidation. She had seen that color before. Her father had called it a promising gray, meaning the kind of stone that carries metal well. She stood in the chamber and turned slowly, holding the lamp in each direction in turn, and she examined the walls. The Colebrook Company's cuts were visible in the east wall, a series of shallow exploratory drifts angled upward to the northeast, following a theory about the vein's direction that was wrong. She had known they were wrong from the survey maps. The cuts were 2 to 3 feet deep and stopped in unremarkable stone, the kind of stone that yields nothing and says nothing, and had been telling the Colebrook miners nothing for years before they stopped listening. She turned away from the east wall and examined the south wall instead. There was a natural fracture in the south wall, a vertical seam about 3 inches wide and running from the chamber floor to a point above her head where it pinched closed. It was packed with mineral matter that had been there long enough to develop a surface oxidation, a dark crust of iron and manganese, and running through the interior of the fracture, visible where the crust had shed in thin plates, was a vein of silver sulfide ore 3 to 4 inches across. She did not shout. She did not make any sound. She stood in front of the south wall of the stoping chamber, at the bottom of a shaft that everyone in the county knew was a killing shaft, and she held her lamp close to the fracture and looked at what the rock had been holding for 11 years, and she breathed slowly in the cold underground air. The vein ran south. She could follow it in the fracture's direction. It was not where the Colebrook Company had ever looked, not within 20 degrees of where they had been cutting, and the size of it, even in this preliminary fracture exposure, was consistent with a productive working. She had read enough ore samples in her father's notebooks to know what a productive grade looked like against a lamp. This was not marginal. She spent 2 hours in the chamber. She measured the fracture's orientation with her compass, noted the depth and the wall readings, took 3 samples of the exposed mineral matter by breaking them free with the probe rod and wrapping them in the handkerchief from her father's coat. She ascended the shaft the same way she had descended, rung by rung, examining each timber set as she passed it. She came up into winter daylight and sat at the collar for a few minutes in the cold before she did anything else. What she did then was write in her notebook for 20 minutes. The date, the depth, the compass reading, the fracture dimensions, a description of the ore's appearance and her estimate of its grade. She wrote it the way her father had written survey observations, in plain numbered statements, without adjectives. Then she put the notebook in her coat pocket and began the walk down the mine road toward Colebrook. There is a particular kind of winter afternoon in the Colorado high country when the light comes in low and lateral from the west, and the snow on the ridge above picks it up and throws it back in a warm orange, and the valley below is still in shadow. It was that kind of afternoon. Vera walked down the road in the shadow of the valley and watched the ridge burn above her, and she thought about what came next. What came next was not simple, and she had known from the beginning that it would not be. The Hatcher's Back claim was hers under territorial law, the mineral rights and the surface claim both. She had the papers. What she did not have was the equipment to work a silver mine, or the capital to obtain it, or the labor. She had $11 invested in the claim, 3 ore samples in her satchel, 2 months of survey notes, a compass reading, and a depth measurement. These things were not nothing. They were, in fact, everything a legitimate prospector needed to begin an orderly conversation with a smelting company or a mining exchange. She also had something more specific. She went to the county recorder's office the following morning and asked to see the original Colebrook Company mineral assay reports, which were public record as filed documents, and she spent 3 hours with those reports, comparing them to the notes she had made in the stopping chamber. The Colebrook Company had been filing assay reports on their northeast drift samples for 2 years before the closure. The grades were poor, between 12 and 18 ounces of silver per ton of ore, which was not productive at the transportation costs of the district. This was part of why they had pushed the West at it so hard and worked their men so dangerously. The northeast drift was not paying, and they were desperate to find the vein they believed had to be there. The records clerk, a young man of perhaps 22 who had clearly not been in the district during the original mine years, watched her from his desk with the expression of someone trying to decide whether what she was doing was unusual enough to comment on. She did not look up from the documents. She had learned in the Denver archive that clerks who watched you were manageable. Clerks who came over to ask whether you needed help were the obstacle. This one stayed at his desk, and she worked through the filed reports in reverse chronological order, from the closure backward to the beginning of the extraction period, reading each assay number into her notes. Their own filed reports, however, contained one anomaly. In the autumn of 1878, a year before the first collapse, the company's assayer had submitted a sample from the stoping chamber's south wall that had returned a grade of 41 ounces per ton. The report was filed. The company had not followed up on it. In the months that followed, they had been pushing the northeast drift and the west at it simultaneously, and the south wall sample had been superseded by the daily work of the north and west cuttings. Then the deaths had come, and everything had stopped. She read the south wall assay report a second time, slowly, to be certain she was reading the location designation correctly. The assayer had written S-wall, stopping chamber, main bore in a clear hand. There was no ambiguity. The sample had come from exactly the section of the south wall she had examined 2 days earlier in the lamplight. The grade was 41 ounces per ton. It was the only south wall sample in the entire file. One assay report. 41 ounces per ton. Filed in the county record and never acted upon. She copied the report number into her notebook. She noted the date it was filed. She asked the clerk to confirm the filing date on the public record, and he did so, and she thanked him, and she walked out. And she sat in the winter cold on the bench outside the county office and considered what she had. The Colebrook Mining Company, which still existed as a registered entity in Denver, had walked away from a producing vein. Their own assay had told them it was there. They had done so because their men had died, and because they had been pushing in the wrong direction, and because the south wall sample had gotten lost in the paperwork of a company in crisis. None of this was fraud. None of this was malice. It was the ordinary human failure of not seeing what was in front of you, multiplied by grief and fear, and the pressure of daily extraction work, and buried in a county file that nobody had gone back to read. The 6 men had died in the west adit. They had not died because of the south wall. The south wall had nothing to do with the deaths, and the deaths had nothing to do with what the south wall held. She understood that as a factual matter. She had spent 2 months making sure she understood it. She took the ore samples to a licensed assayer in the town of Belford, 12 miles east, on a Thursday in late February. She rode Cord's mule and arrived before noon and paid $2 for a standard fire assay on each of the 3 samples. The assayer was a man of about 50 who took the samples without comment and told her they would be ready in 3 days. She rode back to Colebrook and went up to the mine on the Friday and the Saturday and did more measuring work in the stoping chamber, extending her survey of the south wall fracture using the techniques her father had used to estimate a vein's probable extent from its surface expression. She made no additional cuts. She was not extracting ore without a working permit, and she knew it. She was measuring. The assay results came back on a Tuesday. She rode to Belford in a light snowfall and stood at the assayer's counter and read the numbers. The first sample, from the upper margin of the fracture, returned 38 ounces per ton. The second, from the center, returned 52. The third, from the lower margin near the chamber floor, returned 44. She stood with the report papers in her hands and read them twice, and then put them in her oilcloth document tube with the claim papers and the copy of the Colebrook assay report and the survey notes. And she paid the assayer his $2 per sample and walked out into the snow. She had what she needed. The letter she wrote that evening at Hattie Pryor's kitchen table, while Hattie read beside the stove, was addressed to the Hatcher's Back Families Relief Fund, which did not yet exist, because she was creating it in the writing of the letter. She had spent the ride back from Belford thinking about the 6 men and had arrived at a decision that was not complicated once she allowed herself to think it through, which she had been careful not to do before she had the assay results in hand, because a decision arrived at before the facts are confirmed is a different kind of decision from one arrived at after them, and she had wanted no part of the first kind. She had spent the ride thinking about what her father would have done, and the answer was plain enough. He had examined hundreds of shafts. He had walked out of each of them knowing whether men had died, and whether they had died from something that could have been prevented, and whether whoever had the authority to prevent it had chosen otherwise. He had filed reports for 22 years and had never been in a position to do more than file them. She was not in that position. She had the claim papers, and that made the difference between witnessing and doing. 4 of the 6 men had had families in the district, 2 wives still resident in Colebrook, 2 others who had moved to other parts of Colorado after the deaths. She knew their names from the closure notice she still carried in her coat pocket. She knew that the Colebrook Company had paid nothing beyond the bare minimum required under territorial law at the time of the deaths, which was $40 per man in a company-acknowledged accident, and that 3 of the 4 families had received it. The 4th family, a wife and 2 children whose husband had been the man lost in the spring of 1880, had not received the payment because the company had classified that death as unverified and had disputed the claim for 2 years before. The woman gave up and moved away. She wrote the letter carefully. She named the legal instrument she intended to file, a notice of productive claim on the Hatcher's Back mineral rights, with the assay results attached, to be held in trust with the county recorder until she had secured working capital sufficient to begin extraction. She named the terms she was proposing, that 20% of gross revenue from any silver extracted from the South Wall vein, for as long as the vein produced, would be paid into the Hatcher's Back family's relief fund, to be distributed in equal shares to the dependents of the 6 men. She had calculated on the basis of the assay grades and a conservative estimate of the vein's extent what 20% of gross revenue would represent over a working life of 5 to 8 years. The number was large enough to change the material circumstances of the families who remained. She wrote the number down plainly without hedging it. She did not write a cover letter explaining her reasoning. The document was the reasoning. She filed it with the county recorder the next morning, with the assay reports attached as supporting exhibits, and she sent copies by post to the last known addresses of the 4 families. Hattie had the addresses. She had kept them, the way a woman keeps things that no institution thought worth keeping, in a small book in the kitchen drawer. She had not been asked to keep them. She had simply understood that someone should. The Colebrook Mining Company, when notified of the productive claim and the attached assay results, did not contest the mineral rights. They had surrendered them at auction for $11. The rights were Vera's. There was nothing to contest. What the company's representative did, when he arrived in Colebrook from Denver 6 weeks after the filing, was offer to purchase the claim from her. She met him in the county assessor's office, which was the neutral ground she had proposed. He was a man of about 45, well-dressed for the district, with the careful, flat expression of a man who has spent his working life in rooms where things are decided at a remove from the physical world they affect. He placed a figure on the table. It was a reasonable figure for a producing silver claim of the assayed grades, if one did not account for the vein's probable extent. She looked at the figure. She looked at him. She said, without any particular expression of her own, that she was not selling. He asked what she intended to do with a silver mine she had no equipment to work. "Find a partner who supplies equipment," she said. "There are several smelting companies in Denver who will be interested in the assay results. I have already written to one of them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked whether she had considered the history of the shaft. She put her hand in her coat pocket and took out the closure notice she had carried for 3 months, still folded on its original creases, and she set it flat on the table between them. She left her hand on it for a moment. She said that she had thought about the history of the shaft every day since January, and that the south wall vein had no history of claiming any man, and that the deaths in the west adit would not happen again, because the west adit was sealed, and she had done the sealing herself. He looked at the closure notice and then at her. He did not offer a second figure. He understood, she thought, that she had not come to this table to negotiate. She had come to let him see that she knew what the claim was worth and what the company's own records showed, and that there was nothing he could offer her that was worth what she was holding. He left Colebrook the following day. The Denver Smelting Company she had written to send a representative of their own. 6 weeks after that, a man named Fletcher, who arrived with a transit instrument and a copy of her assay reports, and spent 2 days at the mine before returning to Denver and sending her a partnership agreement by post. The agreement was not perfect. She spent a week revising it, with the help of a lawyer in Belford, who charged her $4 and found her revisions technically sound. The final terms gave the smelting company exclusive rights to work the south wall vein in exchange for 30% of gross receipts, with Vera retaining the mineral rights and the surface claim and the right of inspection at any time. The lawyer noted that the right of inspection clause was unusual. "My father put it in every agreement he ever witnessed," she said. It was filed in April of 1884. By June, the smelting company had a crew at Hatcher's Back with a new head frame and a working hoist, and had begun extracting ore from the south wall vein. The first assay on the extracted material came back at 49 ounces per ton, the second at 55. The 2 women who were still in Colebrook received their first fund distributions that September. One of them, whose name was Ruth and who had 2 daughters of school age, came to the boarding house on a Thursday afternoon with a folded paper in her hand, the fund statement the county recorder's office had prepared, and sat in Hattie Pryor's kitchen without speaking for a while after she sat down. She set the paper on the table and smoothed it once, and did not look at it again. She tried to speak and could not, for a while, and then said only that she had not expected this, and did not know how to say what it was. Vera was sitting across the table. She put her hand briefly over Ruth's and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and some things are diminished by words rather than enlarged by them. Outside the kitchen window, the aspens on the ridge had gone yellow, the first turn of autumn, and the light through the glass was the kind of pale gold that does not last. The fund paid distributions for 11 years. The vein extended deeper and richer than Vera's original estimate, a fact the smelting company's mining engineer told her with some professional admiration was unusual for this type of fracture formation. He said it in the tone of a man who expects to be thanked for the compliment. She thanked him and asked him for the extraction figures for the quarter, and he provided them. She took note of it. She had taken note of unusual things all her life. The closure notice stayed in her coat pocket through all of it, through the filing and the negotiations and the partnership agreement and the first season of extraction, until the autumn of the first distribution year, when she took it out and read it one more time, and then folded it into a flat rectangle and slid it into the back of the small notebook, where she had written down what her father said about grief and geological conditions. She kept the notebook in the canvas roll with his tools. The roll stayed in her room at Hattie's boarding house for a long time, through years that accumulated quietly, and then it went with her when she finally took a place of her own, a small house on the south end of Colebrook, bought outright in 1887 with money from the claim. She set the roll of tools on the table in the front room when she moved in and left it there. the way her father had always left his on whatever table was available, where anyone who came in could see it, not because she needed anyone to know about it, because it was his and it was hers now, and it had been worth carrying all those miles and all those years. If you have read this far, you know the kind of patience that kind of carrying requires. Leave your thoughts below, if you are willing. There is another story of a woman and what she found that no one else thought to look for, waiting at the end of this one. This story is a work of historical fiction. The events, characters, and mine described are invented. The territory and era are rendered as accurately as the record allows.